West has ever done. And as a historian, I just feel I've gotten a catbird seat in this. I'm at a 50-yard line seat here. We have Secretary Babbitt. He's materially there. That's him right there. And he had an idea and created the National Landscape Conservation System to really enrich and deepen and add to the mission of Bureau of Land Management. And the outcome of that is that some very spectacular lands and cultural resources are now under protection and headed towards even finer protection. So it's really one of the things as a historian to be a bystander. And Deputy Secretary Hayes, who was in that office at the time with Secretary Babbitt and is now back in that office, this is really, well, again, as I say to many people, I never had the chance to meet Theodore Roosevelt, but I have met these guys, so I'm very fortunate in that. Irrelevant to their lives, but relevant to ours at the Center. At 7:30 tonight on Rocky Mountain Public Television, the Setting the American West film, The Lover's Guide to the American West, Living with Energy, will air. So that is a huge thing for us. We've been on a very long slog to get that film ready, and I bet, I can't imagine how much you would enjoy that. If we got your DVDs, you'd watch those, wouldn't you? It's only half an hour, so it wouldn't take too much from your busy life. So if you're around the television set at 7:30 tonight, you turn on Channel 6 and watch that. Now, Carl Roundtree will be introducing the two speakers. Carl Roundtree is the director of the National Landscape Conservation Service. He's been a joy to get to know, a wonderful person to work with, one of the greatest talent scouts for identifying speakers of note and bringing them into our circles. So it's really a great pleasure to introduce one of my favorite public servants, Carl Roundtree.
Thank you very much. We've heard over the last day some epic tales of heroes and great stories about conservation. And you're going to meet two of the best warriors this morning when you get a chance to hear Secretary Babbitt and Deputy Secretary Hayes. But before we start, I wanted to take a moment to do what I think Secretary Babbitt envisioned when he created the National Landscape Conservation System, and that is just to take time to honor two people who we consider to be extremely good partners in helping us do what we do in terms of managing this incredible system. And they are two people that are closely affiliated with the Center of the American West, Patty Limerick and Kurt Goodyard. Kurt, are you here? Please come up on stage. We have a little something we'd like to do. These two were actually the talent and did all the hard lifting in putting together this symposium, which celebrates the 10th anniversary of the National Landscape Conservation System. And they've been great partners. They've made it happen. We had, through the efforts of both our National Operations Center and Bobby Winslow, who's also been very active in helping us put this thing together, created a series of pins for each of the components of the National Landscape Conservation System. And we've mounted them on a shadow box, which we're also going to give the Secretary and Deputy Secretary, as a memento of all their efforts in helping us achieve what we've tried achieving here these 2 days. So I want to thank you, Patty, for all your work. Thank you so much. And Kurt, for all your hard work. It's just been a joy. Thank you. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to introduce the two speakers that you're going to be hearing today. And also to recognize, for many of us in the audience, two people that have had quite a considerable influence on our careers, both in terms of providing us the people you strive to try to emulate in managing public lands, as well as creating a marvelous system that has been created, which we're celebrating the 10th anniversary, the National Landscape Conservation System. It's done more than just simply set aside what now are 27 million acres of some of the most spectacular landscapes that the Bureau of Land Management manages. It's also done a great deal, I think, in terms of helping us understand the other part of our multiple-use mission, which is conservation, and using conservation as one of the fundamental premises for managing the public lands. Coincidentally, I met both of these gentlemen in the Headwaters Forest. And it's probably appropriate that I did. There are all sorts of wonderful stories that I'm not going to go into today, but which I think would be great fodder for some novel, of Secretary Babbitt and State Director Hasty, and some of the deliberations in creating Headwaters. Some you heard yesterday was a delightful story, Mr. Secretary, about some of the things that went on in its creation. And both played a remarkable role. There's a wonderful article that appeared in a law journal not too long ago, written by David, which talks about some of the 11-hour discussions that went on in actually signing the papers for the Headwaters Forest. I think the time had lapsed on the East Coast. We still had 3 hours on the West Coast to consummate the deal, and it was largely through David's efforts that we were able to consummate that. Secretary has been a very strong influence in my career, both in terms of the monuments that he created while I was in California and the time I spent in Arizona. But when I got to Arizona as the Associate State Director, I found out that much of the tenure, the land tenure of Arizona, had been modified dramatically by the efforts of this incredible conservationist and leader in the conservation movement. Many of the areas that we now manage as monuments were in private ownership through his efforts as governor of the state of Arizona. He was able to work with the Bureau and change the landscape to help us in terms of managing these areas more efficiently and more effectively as contiguous units. Many of you already know much of the background behind Secretary Babbitt. He did serve as governor and was reelected twice in Arizona. Prior to being governor of Arizona, he also served as the Attorney General of Arizona as well. He grew up in northern Arizona, and his family was very closely tied to the land and to the movement and conservation. His father playing a very active role in the conservation efforts across the country. And so it is a great honor to be up on the same stage and welcoming Secretary Babbitt. Deputy Secretary Hayes is the Deputy Secretary in the Department of Interior. He liked the job so much during the Clinton administration, I think he came back for a second term under this one. And we're glad he did. He's just been a wonderful person for us to be able to work with in advancing the cause for the National Landscape Conservation System. Secretary Babbitt is going to get up and is going to talk with you all, share some thoughts with you. Following the Secretary's comments, David is going to have some points that he would also like to make. And if we could, would like to just save any questions that you might have, which we will be taking following this at the conclusion of their remarks. So, to introduce to you the architect of America's better idea, the National Landscape Conservation System.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate the introduction, and of course, I'm delighted to be here. Let me start with Patty Limerick. You heard her say she never met Theodore Roosevelt, but she does know me. Patty, I never met Frederick Jackson Turner. I never met Bernard DeVoto, but I have met you. This wonderful historian and teacher and leader has really been an important influence in my life and in the development of this center. I just want to thank Patty for her insights, her guidance, her wonderful teaching role. Many people don't see perhaps quite as often or as directly as her work as a historian. This is really quite something. Dave Hayes, what do I say? He'll say it for himself. He's been a great partner for many, many years now. Bob Addy is here. All the BLM crew, I'll have more to say all of you in the course of my remarks. But, you're off to a terrific start, and I am pleased and honored to have been a part of the BLM during my 8 years. What I'd like to do briefly this morning is see if I can look to the future of this system. And I think the best way to do that is to take some time and look to the past. Now, when people are in my sort of 7th inning of a career, looking to the past is always dangerous because it tends to generate endless anecdotes that seem to have little constructive value. But I'm going to take that chance today. I'm going to reach back into deep time and lay out a few tales of what went on, from which I hope to extract 3 or 4 thoughts about the future and what the challenges that we have before us. My immersion in this issue of BLM conservation, I remember very clearly, began on Easter weekend of 1993. There was a bill in the United States Congress, the California Desert Protection Act. And I thought, I better get out there and see this California desert. So during that weekend, I found myself in the hands of the redoubtable Ed Hastings, who was the California BLM director. And we trekked and camped and walked across that landscape. And Ed was in an especially feisty mood. I was really prepared for it. His purpose in that trip was to say, this bill is an outrage. It is taking 1 million acres of the Mojave Desert from the BLM and transferring it to the National Park Service. And he said, Mr. Secretary, that's wrong. This is BLM country. We know this land and we can manage it better than anyone. And if you really care about the BLM, you're going to have the courage to do something about this continual carving away BLM land and transferring it to other agencies. I was the first kind of taken back by this disregard for protocol. But I started thinking about it, and I thought, yeah, he's got a point, and he's got his history right, because in fact, the entire history of the BLM up to that time had been sort of a staging area for other agencies to carve off land, first for the National Forest System, then for wildlife refuges, and remarkably, I thought, for units created under the Antiquities Act. Non-stop throughout the 20th century. They had gone mostly to the Park Service, once in a while to Fish and Wildlife or the Forest Service. And I dusted myself off, went back to Washington, went up to Capitol Hill and said to the sponsors of the Desert Protection Act, I've got a new idea. Let's rewrite this bill. That was my introduction to the conservation crowd in the United States Congress, and they said, stay out of here. This bill is on track to completion. We don't need any advice from a newcomer to Washington. But they were in fact wrong, because the bill, we testified for it, worked for it, and it passed on the last day of that session of Congress, in a holdover session. The majority leader had carried through a weekend to try to beat down a cloture vote, which failed by exactly 1 vote in the California Desert Protection Act that became law. Well, that was kind of the end for a while. Nothing much took place. And then in 1996, the Grand Staircase Escalante discussion began very quietly. It was intended to be sort of a closely held kind of lead-up to the use of the Antiquities Act. And I remember that discussion with Ed Hastings. I said, wow, now's the opportunity, because as we drafted that proclamation, I realized I didn't have to go persuade the Congress. I didn't have to go argue with all these rowdy conservation groups, which was making my life miserable. I had an audience of one, the president. Drafted into the proclamation, Bureau of Land Management, and it happened. It happened in ways that I hadn't quite anticipated, because you know the reaction to that proclamation was a veritable firestorm. I explained to the president the fact that there were effigies of him and his secretary hanging side by side from the lampposts in the streets of Escalante was just another sort of kind of Western tradition. It would all pass in due course, but it was a turbulent time. And the reaction to the Grand Staircase Proclamation was really more intense than even I had anticipated. It gave me cause now that we had sort of put BLM in the business for the first time to ask, what should we be doing? What's the issue? In addition to all the usual, predictable complaints. And I started to understand there really was one thing that we could do better. That the opponents were making a big issue of the lack of process, of the lack of transparency, the fact that it was done over the trance. Like monuments that had often been done in the past, but nonetheless, I thought, as a Westerner, I understand that, but people understandably have an expectation of being insulted even when they don't like the ultimate result. Well, I got to tell you, there wasn't much interest in monuments in the wake of all that turbulence. Everything just kind of died down for a couple of years. 2 years went by. And then after the midterm election, 1998, it occurred to me that we were now a lame duck administration and that we had political capital, which we were either going to use or it would expire and be gone forever. And I was out in California on a trip to a place called Otay Mountain, right on the border outside of San Diego. Then, as now, it was about immigration, and the Border Patrol was going to build a road every 100 yards across the border, across this wonderful area just east of San Diego. It's been a day out on the mountain with the Border Patrol, trying to put an understanding on it. In the course of that, I looked over this mountain. It was BLM land. And I thought, look, I'm a lame duck too. All they can do is fire. So I stood up in front of the press and on the spot said, I think I'm going to recommend the president to make it, and sort of ducked for cover. But that's not what happened. It's quite astonishing. The San Diego press picked it up, plastered it all over the newspapers, and the supervisors came forward and said, yeah, wait on it. And I knew that something was really stirring when the Republican congressman from that district sort of came in and said, that's a great idea, but I want credit. So, they have to sponsor legislation to preempt my recommendation to the president. And I'm saying, I think I learned something. I think what I learned at Otay Mountain was that by front-ending a proposal, we could throw out of the Escalante venom and just Let everybody have their say. Just go out and say, yeah, this is what we might do. Now, I then hesitated for a moment, because mind you, this is California. This wasn't the West. But I thought, this is worth a try. Maybe we should try it in the West. And I looked around and said, where is the most favorable place where I can try to push us a little further to kind of see the landscape without risking my job or the wrath of my friend the president. And I thought, well, it's Arizona. It's my state. I looked at the electoral politics of Congress and I found this had nothing to do with my decision. I did nothing. That there were no marginal Democrats in congressional districts. No Democrats impacted by this proposal. I thought, I'll have a hearing in my hometown of Boulder. Surely they will have some reverence for one of their great political leaders. I showed up in the midst of a firestorm. 300 people organized all over Arizona and just took its foot for 3 hours. Anger, vitriol. The congressional delegation didn't like the idea. It wasn't congressional hearing. Took shots for a couple hours from the congressional delegation. Just on the verge of saying, well, quite sure where we're headed. But my press secretary walked in and showed me the poll that Arizona Republic had taken. And it showed that 76% of Arizonans, urban and rural, supported the line idea. And I started then to see, there really is a change going on in the West. There really are conservation constituencies, even in Arizona. And that was real easy. I then went to the president and said, look, 76% of Arizona, and the monument was created. We picked Grand Canyon, which is kind of the lost leader of Romans, located the monument right next to Grand Canyon. And it's kind of an iconic place, and it really helped. But it was 1 million acres. It doubled the size of the protected area of the Grand Canyon. And is now the Grand Canyon Parish National Monument. Well, that's the point at which the lesson of time now, it really comes home. The idea is get past all of the loud, tense, focused, lobby constituencies. Get out there in front of the public and tap the change of perception in the West about conservation. Clearly there, that was the lesson. But we made some progress, got some others doing. The president understandably was still not wholly persuaded that this really was a great thing to stake a lot of political capital on. One afternoon, in kind of frustration about time running out, not getting this stuff moving. I went back to my office and I had an idea. I got out a 4x5 card, and in the left-hand column, I wrote Theodore Roosevelt. In the right-hand column, I wrote William Jefferson Clinton. And I tallied up in the TR column all of his accomplishments, acreage, numbers, and then I did the Clinton column. And it was pretty good, but there was still ways to go. Stuck it in my pocket. I was at the White House that night for a state dinner, and in the reception line, I handed this card to the president. And big line back and up, kind of looks at it. Starts to put his pocket, he says, really would. That's the moment I knew that I had it. He saw one word on that card, legacy. they're going to compare me to Theodore Roosevelt. And it was all wide open after that. He called me up at 2 a.m. in the night and said, Bruce, you got any more of those monuments coming out for you? Needless to say, I tried very hard not to disappoint his expectations. We moved along with Los Angeles, a whole variety of other monuments. And then we began to see the next lesson, and that was that by fronting these monuments and getting a public discussion, we could play on the lesson of what time on even more directly by encouraging the president to lay out a proposal and then invite Congress into the discussion and invite Congress to legislate. And the logic of it is quite clear because the Congress, the delegation from states involved, would be looking around and saying, the President has the power to act unilaterally. And we now know that he will act. So when his Interior Secretary is out there on a day trip to somewhere, saying this is a great landscape, maybe it would make a great monument. But it was really time to design if they wanted to be part of the shaping process. And that once they were invited, the President equally had the power to manage the discussion by the potential use of his veto power, which is in the back. And we created a good number of monuments in that process. Matt Donaldson is here, and either has or will be telling you about the experience at Los Angeles. It happened at San Jacinto. It happened at Colorado Canyons. I'm sorry. And it happened out in the Hawaiian Islands, with the great Northwest Hawaiian Islands Marine Reserve. I'd like to leave you with one specific example. I call it the Oregon option because I think it is the very best example of how this process of laying out a proposal, inviting public discussion, and then drawing in the congressional players, usually beginning with the state that's involved, but certainly extending even more broadly. Have any of you ever been to Steve's Mountain? Well, you're a good cross-section of Oregon and of the West. Most people have never heard of Steve's Mountain. It's a fabulous black fault mountain out in the Great Basin of Eastern Oregon. And unlike a lot of those mountains, it's a big one. It's over 10,000 feet elevation. That's great. Fir forests on top, streams running off the side, and a couple hundred miles at least to the nearest gas station. So we got out there. I got out there with Governor Fitzhugh, and we went through this usual kind of mantra process of admiring the scenery, speculating out loud, speculating. A great national monument. Everybody knew the code word and the language for what that was about. And the Oregon delegation came rushing forward and saying, "You can't do that. We want to participate." So we called a timeout. We sat down with the Oregon delegation. And what makes Steve's Mountain so interesting is that in some ways, the legislative result was more interesting than we could have managed under the powers of the Antiquities Act, because what we got at Steve's Mountain was the following. First of all, in the marketing section, we drew a 900,000 acre circle into the Alfred Desert around the mountain, used that as a platform for a complete mineral and hydrothermal withdrawal. We then zoomed in to about 500,000 acres, which surrounded the mountain, and set up the equivalent of the National Conservation Area. But then, within that, we created a couple 100,000 acres of statutory wilderness, half of which have grazing, livestock grazing, eliminated. Perhaps the first time that had ever been done. It was a few times that's been done in a wilderness designation. And then on top of that, took the streams coming off the mountain and made them and put them in the wild and scenic river blocks. And then looked at the Endangered Species Act and created some other statutory reserves for an endangered trout species. And then wrapped it all up in a piece of legislation. And because the delegation supported it, it was transformed into law. I hold that out. Las Ciénegas is another interesting example in Arizona. But I've seen some kind of model with which I would say open this process up. Invite everybody in. And interesting things that can surely happen. Well, where are we? Let me see if I can emerge out of the dark past now in the present time. Really, by the end of this, we started looking around and saying we've collected all of these monuments on a base of existing, some conservation areas, some wilderness areas, national trail of wild and scenic areas. Just kind of put it all together. And that was the genesis of the event that we're recognized on its 10th anniversary today. But I have to tell you, of much more importance was the legislation that happened last year when Senator Bingaman, Senator Salazar, Congressman Grahal obtained a statutory designation of the National Landscape Conservation System. The importance of that is that once you have a congressional imprimatur in legislation, it really signals that the system is tolerated, and implicitly that there will now be broad-based support for administration, for funding, for future expansion. So there's no gainsaying the real importance of that designation is now 1 year old. And I can't pass by it without making this point. Legislation doesn't happen because some senator walked into his office one day and said, I've got a great idea. It happens because there's always an undercurrent of people who relentlessly shape decisions passing to that legislation. One of them is here today. His name is Bill Meadows, the head of the Wilderness Society. Second one is Dick Moe, the head of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. A lot of people, but I would add that I would put up at the head of the line, Bill Meadows, Dick Moe, and Molly Cusick. There's kind of a shadowy thing. It seems to be everywhere and nowhere. But she was my counsel when I was secretary. She was really the person who animated all of this sequence that I discussed. We had the ideas and energy and the pleasant, maternal, non-threatening presence to show up in places in the West where I would have been lynched on sight. So that's how these things happen. But now let me move to the future. The first question, I guess, is this effort, now a museum piece is kind of frozen in time? And the answer, of course, has to be no, that the system should have the capacity to grow, to deepen, and to expand. And the good news, the really good news is that that's actually happening. It's happening in the most unlikely of places, the United States Congress. Because in the bill that is statutorily approved for this system, the Congress added about 1.25 million acres of new units to the system. The Dominguez Escalante National Conservation, Wilderness National Conservation in Colorado, a couple more in Utah, a whole flock of wilderness areas, another statutory designation, meaning that the Congress contemporaneously establishing the system answered the question, is it frozen in time? No. The answer is a clear no, coming from the Congress. So, what's our task and what should we be? I'm really pleased to have a representative of the administration. So now turn to David Hayes and say, David, take these ideas back to your boss. Okay? First of all, let's see if I can cover 3 points. The first one would be, when you see President Obama, explain to him the lessons learned at Otay Mountain and Grand Canyon Parish. That is, the old way of doing monuments over the transom, just kind of at random, often on your way out of office. Not the right way to go. Mr. President, what you need to do is look over these lists and get moving. I'd like to see him do Bristol Bay just because offshore is now very much in discussion. There are lots of other ones. Important things for the President and his advisors to make their choices based on their lists. And to simply make the simple announcement. I am ready to consider using the Antiquities Act for this place. Setting in motion a public discussion, which should be free of the rancor of Grand Staircase Susquehanna, because we're saying the West is a different place. There's a lot of constituencies out there. Let's invite them and have a discussion. Second, I would say to the President, Mr. President, look at the Oregon option. As you lay out a proposal, drawing the public in, be especially thoughtful about saying to the Congress, we'd actually entertain legislation. We'd like legislation. There's more power to shape good results. And you have the power to shape because you can demand minimum standards because the legislation has to be acceptable to you. But draw them in, starting in the state where you make the proposal. Make it crystal clear. We're not nailing monument pelts on the wall. We're looking for protected areas. If it comes by legislation, we all win. And that's good. Lastly, a word about what it is we need together on the threshold of the permanent emerging of this system. I think even as we say to the President, here are things you can do, we need to stir a big West-wide discussion of all of the possibilities. We need to broaden and expand the field and sort of kind of come out from this sort of, this will be controversial. This will cause all sorts of pain and suffering and anguish. And just say, here is the palette of BLM land in the West. And let's start looking and talking. It's easy to do. Just get a map of your state or the West and find the yellow squares. And get up with a crayon and map on the wall and start looking and talking. And listening. But one thing we found as we went through this process was that almost without exception, if you got deep enough in these areas, you would find that there had been or was then the beginnings of a support group. Now, there aren't any original observations in the West. I thought I was the first guy in Steamstown. I thought, they'll remember me as the Lewis and Clark of Steamstown. It's not true. There's always someone. A lot of them, interestingly enough, for reasons that I don't fully understand, were kind of back in the New Deal days in the 30s. I think it's because there was a political, very feisty, kind of broad spread of political stuff going. We found that at Escalante. The proposals to make the Escalante a national park, they're going clear back to the 19th times. So if you start looking at the landscape, look and listen to who's there. You find interesting things. The BLMers had good ideas. Now, in the old BLM, they were always at the grassroots level because the top of the pyramid was kind of soft because they'd grown up in a different kind of environment. And out there at the bottom of the pyramid, there was a kind of new generation of people, those who were kind of looking and a lot of great ideas. Use your imagination. It really is changing. Bill Richardson, governor of Mexico, wrote an impassioned letter a couple of months ago to the president saying, please use your executive authority to make a national monument out of Otero Mesa in southern New Mexico. Now, I don't know what I would have done if a Western governor had President Clinton saying, make a national monument. It would have been inconceivable. I can tell you one thing. I would have been on the first airplane. And the subject matter of that letter said, if the governor of the state is ready to go, let's have that. The important thing about the Richardson letter is it is yet another example of the changing, developing situations, of the emergency, if you will, of the New West. I want to say a few things now to just a couple of groups. First is to the Conservation Lands Foundation. Every conservation effort and movement in the history of this country has had of necessity a citizen support group behind it with really important efforts and advice and support to give. The Park Service has one, the Forest Service in different ways has had those groups. Fish and Wildlife Service has been saturated with support groups from the day it was created. And the emerging group now is the National Conservation Foundation. Support them. Pay attention because they are the outside group that can interact with Bureau Land Management and important interact with local support groups. Some of you are here today. The Escalante crowd is out there in force, being as pushy and aggressive as they've always been. I can hardly get away from it this morning. Really, the right level of interaction with the Conservation Foundation, local support groups. We ought to be able to get this above the radar into a real good interactive Western discussion. But there'll be a lot of questions as those discussions go forward. What should a monument be? How does a monument differ from a unit of action? So, lots of those questions. I'm not here today trying to answer them, because I think in many ways, they're very site-specific questions. They need to be mulled over and worked down by the people on the ground. I can tell you that a BLM unit is not a national park. It is not going to be full of internal developments to accommodate visitors. It's going to be a different kind of undeveloped, where you're on your own. You want support services? Go to the local community. They're the ones who interact with all of this. Traditional uses are going to continue to the extent that they often are compatible with what goes on and conservation ends of the unit. And obviously lots of links to the cultural and historical and community and open space setting in which they are found. Obviously, I guess what I would say is those discussions proceed in their shape. The one kind of irreducible, absolute minimum is simply a clear understanding and a clear mandate, whether in an executive order or in legislation, that conservation of the resource is the indispensable, irreducible, overarching requisite, beneath which the blanks can and should be building. Lastly, I want to leave 5 minutes for David Hayes. Lastly, a word for the BLM. And Bob actually touched on some of these things yesterday. This is off to a great start. But don't take it for granted, because there are, I'm sure, plenty of skeptics out there who, looking backwards, say, we're not really sure that this idea is compatible with our view of the BLM as a sort of universal, multi-use kind of platform, and we don't take much consolation from reading the distant past. And it's kind of like, the wolves on the north slope of Alaska. You see them circling all the time around caribou birds, waiting to pick off anyone who falters, and anyone who does not keep up the overall sort of momentum of the herd. So, the wolves are out there. I want to name them. I'm not an expert in wolf biology. But this is the fact of government writ large. So you've got to justify your mission. You've got to really put some power into it and really believe and move. But I'm certain you can find real public support. And I'm confident you can do it. I really believe what Ed Hastings said nearly 20 years ago out there in the desert. He said, we can do it. And I believe you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. You left me 10 minutes. That's pretty good. I want to first thank Patty for putting on this program and her terrific team here. First, a confession. I am not a child of the West, or, in fact, and my first introduction to Patty Limerick was reading a terrific book about the conquest of the West, and it was part of my education about the West. When I was first nominated for Deputy Secretary under Bruce, I would go visit people like Conrad Burns and folks like that. And I'd say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "I'm from Western New York State." Didn't work that well. Somehow I got through. Now, actually, I'm surrounded by Coloradans, in the current department, and I am proud to be from the East, and I'm making some progress, I should say. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with Ken Salazar, and he was talking about some of the important landscapes of the country. And he talked about the San Luis Valley course and the California Bay Delta and the Everglades. He mentioned the Finger Lakes of New York State. All right, making some progress. But today is really to celebrate what is truly a milestone, the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the National Landscape Conservation System. And Bruce's anecdotes are right on point. And what the last paragraph of that story needs to be emphasized here, which is that it was Bruce Babbitt that created this magnificent new conservation legacy. Let's give him a hand and stand up. For me, I've heard the story about the cards and the president, but when it comes to legacies, with all due deference to President Clinton, it's Bruce Babbitt that we're going to be remembering in this way. And I pulled out of my attic a self-promotional piece that our department put out at the end of Bruce Babbitt's tenure, with showing a picture of him and Bill. I showed it to Bruce yesterday. He, sort of looked puzzling at it. He never said he never read this kind of propaganda. But he did take it to his room last night. And there's an excerpt from the speech he gave. And there's just a couple of paragraphs that are right on point that I thought I would read that I think capture some of the essence of the importance of the process and the reality that is our National Conservation Landscape System. Here's what he says. Using the Antiquities Act of 1906, President Clinton really has preserved more land in the lower 48 states than anyone since Teddy Roosevelt. That was the final card he presented to the president. There are two important points I'd like to make about the Antiquities Act. One is the way in which we've learned to use it. In the old days, presidents on their way out of office would just sort of toss proclamations over the transom. See, he writes his hopes. But we've gone out and engaged on the front end with local citizens and the Congress and used an interactive process. Use of the Antiquities Act serves not only to expedite protection of important landscapes through the presidential pen, but it also serves to give emphasis to Congress to do its share. This is really important, really timely, and Bruce explained it in a very real way. The second point is that these new national monuments have helped create a new mission for the Bureau of Land Management. In the past, monuments generally were administered by the National Park Service, but in the case of the new monuments we've created, it's not just about stacking up numbers of monuments protected, it's about saving an agency, saying to BLM employees, put your heads up and look at the next century. You have a lot of fabulous land. You're right up there with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service as a first-class conservation agency. That is a legacy. Those 2 points, how to do it, and then what it means to the largest landowner of the United States, 267 million acres of Bureau of Land Management. And so this action that we're celebrating, the creation of the National Landscape Conservation System, we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary, Bruce's brainchild and implementer, really is an invitation for BLM, for Bob Abbey and Ed Roberson and others, and I see Pat Shea in the audience, the former BLM director, to join the top ranks of conservation organizations. The BLM has the land, has the landscapes. What it needed was the shot in the arm, the confidence building, the honor of elevating conservation on some of those special landscapes above the multiple use mission, if you will, recognizing that for some landscapes, conservation should be and is king. So Bruce Babbitt provided that early boost. And it was the monuments and the heft of the effort that preserved the idea over 8 years of subterfuge, attempts to undermine, and certainly neglect. However, I want to emphasize something that Bruce said. During that period, many of you were busy. Many of you saw the importance of what Bruce had done and wanted to preserve that legacy. And I agree with Bruce. What happened early last year with the signing of the Omnibus Public Lands Act was a huge watershed, because you cannot count on something like an administratively created National Landscape Conservation System surviving unless you validate it with the pen of the President after congressional approval. And some of you were with me in the East Room of the White House. It was the first major bill signing of this President. Who introduced the President? Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar. Who was behind the President? A group of folks, including Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, Senator Bob Bennett of Utah, and others. It was and remains the touchstone for this next 8 years of conservation that President Obama is now underway with. And thank all of you. Thank you for making that happen. It would not have happened without Bill and others here and their strong support. So what's next for the NCLS and for the conservation agenda of this administration? How will the public lands fit into what we're about now at today's Department of the Interior? Well, we've been in office for a little more than a year, and I'll offer you a proposition that we're on a track that will once again celebrate conservation as one of our nation's primary values. Even as we respect and address the important role that public lands play in our energy economy and other traditional uses of our land. Now let me offer some early data points to back up that proposition. First is President Obama, in his first two budgets, including the current budget that's in front of Congress, fiscal year 11 budget that is a freeze, essentially, has committed to and is following through on a commitment to restore full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. President George Bush, when he was campaigning for president in 2000, promised to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Yet, over the 8 years of the Bush presidency, the fund was hollowed out. The last year, I think, $140 million out of $900 million. This is a central piece of the conservation agenda, born out of a meeting held in Secretary Stuart Udall's office in 1963-64 with Gil Grosvenor and Ed Norton and others, and with the idea being, as we are extracting resources from our nation, oil and gas, etc., and reaping some economic benefit, let's pour some of that back into conservation. That was the concept, and a fabulous concept it was. Through time, the Land and Water Conservation Fund has funded much of the expansion of our public lands and the protection of lands, restoration of rivers, wonderful stuff. President Obama has committed to fully fund, get back to fully funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund by 2014. He's on track to do it. More than $500 million in the current fiscal year 11 budget. This is big, and it's going to continue even as we freeze our budgets going forward because of the challenges of our economy. Secondly, I think you're seeing with our administration a recommitment to a restoration agenda. I really enjoyed the nostalgia here of reading about Bruce's magnificent tenure as Secretary of the Interior. And I recall a retreat we had out at the National Conservation Training Center, well, the senior staff, and Bruce asked all of us, what is the word that should define how we are approaching our landscapes? And I recall Kevin Gober saying, honor, and in a wonderfully, Native American sense, honor our landscapes. And then others suggested other names. What came through ultimately was restore, restoration, bringing back, respecting our landscapes. We're back at it now with the Obama administration. And you're seeing it with a commitment to the Great Lakes, a recommitment to the Everglades, to the California Bay Delta, to these huge landscapes that of national significance that need restoration, and to smaller landscapes as well, through the Land and Water Conservation Fund and other financial and partnership possibilities. You're also seeing, I know, a rebalancing of our decision-making on the public lands. Being smarter and more thoughtful from the start. Now, I have a unique vantage point on this. My nomination was held up for several months by Senator Bob Bennett, who was very unhappy that Secretary Ken Salazar early on canceled 77 proposed oil and gas leases in Utah. And I had to, there's a penance that you go through in these circumstances. And my penance was not 3 Hail Marys, but it included a trip to Vernal, Utah, to have a chat with the locals there. It was quite an experience, actually. Got off the plane at the airport. There's a big sign, "Welcome, David Hayes." And the auditorium was overflowing. Hundreds of folks, extra security, because of a concern that the Obama administration was, saying no to oil and gas and acting hastily against their interests. And what we did there, and this is Bruce's anecdotes are right on point, because often, and Bruce used to say this, good public policy comes from local examination of issues and sort of getting your hands dirty, learning what's going on, and then broadening the lens and applying that learning. That's what we did in Utah. And I did a review. I looked at all 77 sites. I overflew Desolation Canyon, 9 Mile Canyon, BLM lands, and wondered why we were thinking of putting oil and gas rigs in some of these places. And wondering how it could be that whatever was nominated by industry would automatically be auctioned, regardless of whether there was infrastructure there or not, regardless of the recreational uses, regardless of the scenic values. We triggered an investigation that was done by a dozen career folks, including at least one. Chris, are you here still? I think you left. Forest Service, BLM, a multidisciplinary team. They came back with a recommendation on what to do on these leases, and they created the blueprint for a new reform agenda that we are now, we have rolled out in draft form, and it will be rolled out in final form within the next month, that says we are going to be more thoughtful about how we do oil and gas leasing decisions in our country. We are going to look at the landscape writ large and suggest we do oil and gas leasing where it makes sense and not where it doesn't.
Yay.
Of course, this is after I've confirmed. And we're trying to be smart from the start also on renewable energy. Ken Salazar and the President feel very strongly that we need to power a new energy economy in this country, and it's going to require some compromises. We're going to need to have big solar and big wind if we're going to have energy security, if we're going to deal with climate change, and turn around our reliance on foreign oil. But we're trying to, and Bob Andy's phrase, and we talk about it a lot in our department, is smart from the start. In California, in Arizona, in Nevada, we're working with stakeholders. We're taking that large landscape approach. Where does it make sense potentially to do these projects? Where are the transmission lines? Where are the degraded lands? Where can we do it in a way that where folks will be will make sense of this, and where we're not affecting landscapes that we need to preserve. And it's a tough process, but I am really pleased with the conservation community, which has been our partner with this, with the utilities, which has been our partner with this. And we are pushing hard, but we're not taking shortcuts, and we're going to show that if you're smart from the start, you can make sensible decisions on our public lands and respect all the values we need to respect. So watch us on that. Keep our feet to the fire on that. All of you who care about these issues, and it's everyone in this room. But I think you're seeing from the Obama administration a thoughtful approach here, and an approach that will remind folks that we can develop a new energy economy. More to follow on that. Also, I hope that you saw another sign of the Obama administration's approach with our offshore oil and gas announcement. Now, Bruce wanted a monument. So we may get there, Bruce. But President Obama did sign a formal presidential withdrawal of Bristol Bay from any oil and gas drilling as long as he is president. And we're open to going further for more permanent protection. There should not be oil and gas drilled in Bristol Bay. Period. And yes, we're going to look at other areas, but we really are going to look. We really are going to rely on the National Environmental Policy Act. We really are going to get the best science together. Just earlier this week, Ken Salazar announced a special effort in the Arctic where we have called a timeout. We have canceled 5 lease sales in the Chukchi and Beaufort because of the sensitivity of the Arctic. And we've said, timeout, let's take a look. Dr. Marcia McNutt, head of the United States Geological Survey and oceanographer of first rank, is undertaking a special review of the science. We're going to have science tell us what to do. Finally, in terms of suggestions of why you should think we're on the right track. I am in politics after all. Climate change and the climate impacts on our natural resources, affecting our monuments, affecting all units of our national conservation system, all of our parks, all of our communities. This was an issue that had to be handled during the Bush administration behind closed doors, in the closet, if you will. We have brought it out to the sunlight, and it is understanding what climate change is doing to our resources, our land, our wildfire risk, invasive species, to our water resources, to our wildlife resources, new ranges, etc., is hugely important to how we decide to manage our public land and our private lands going forward. We have a very ambitious agenda there. We are driven by science, number one. We're creating regional science centers that will scale down that information on what global changes are to what's important and what's happening in local areas. We established our first climate change center in Alaska about a month ago. We have 7 more coming, and we have funding for it and support of the president for it. And then, and this is the most interesting part, using that data. We're on a grand experiment here. And this is the next stage, I think, of conservation. With climate change, the Park Service, BLM can't act on its own. If we're going to adapt to climate change and make sensible decisions in the face of climate change, by its nature, climate change impacts are broader than that. Sea rise doesn't respect the border of a national seashore and a community pier. The whole community has an impact on how we react to climate change. So we're creating landscape conservation cooperatives to draw in partners, to draw in all local decision makers, to feed the data to that group, to be around the table and talk about how to react to the climate impacts that we're seeing. It's an experiment. We're doing it as a department across our bureaus. It's tough. It's going to require a new way of thinking for our partners, for ourselves, but we have it funded. We are moving out, and please help us make this work. It's a new model that has the potential to remind folks that the feds can actually be helpful, can actually bring some data to the table, can help make decisions in concert with local communities, and have a feedback loop that brings more data to the table as more decisions are being made. So, now finally, I said that was kind of, finally, we're at an inflection point and a pivot point in the Obama administration, even as we are not yet 14 months into it. The pivot point is tomorrow morning, back in Washington, D.C. President Obama is coming to the Interior Department to give a major address on conservation. He'll be speaking at 10 a.m. I'm not going to give away what he's going to say, except to just point out how extraordinary this is. Step back for a minute. We are less than a year and a half in. President Obama, by the way, has been in our building 5 times already. But tomorrow we're getting a major address on conservation. I think what you're going to hear, I'm supposed to not give this away, but you're going to hear a call for a national conversation on conservation. You're going to have our chief executive empowering our cabinet to go out to communities and do what Bruce did and talk about at a local level what conservation means, why it's important, and how we move ahead collectively as a country to protect special places. It's extraordinary. Some of you are going to be there. Bruce is going to be in the front row. I made sure of that. And I think it is a key pivot point. It comes also at a time when we are seeing a lot of themes come together. First Lady Michelle Obama is concerned about childhood obesity and the youth of our country and what's happening. I read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, 18-year-olds typically spend 11 hours a day in front of some kind of media. They're not getting outdoors. They're not getting connected. That's part of a conservation agenda. Bringing our youth in, bringing our disadvantaged communities in, reconnecting with the outdoors. We're going to call this America's Great Outdoors. If I had more time, I'd give you some funny stories about some other things we tried and failed. But we can all use a little help with the names. I think the National Conservation Landscape might be something that we work on as well. But in any event, I hope that we have learned the lessons that Bruce Babbitt taught us, and I am looking forward to working with the President and with Ken Salazar, who feels these issues in his gut. He grew up in, as you well know, in this state, in a hardscrabble ranch in southern Colorado, next to BLM land. When he was Attorney General, championed the protection of the Great Sand Dunes down there. He was a proud sponsor of the Dominguez Escalante Conservation Area. He knows that he can recite all statistics from the Omnibus Public Land Act because he was a key proponent of it. He helped push it through. He's the one who called Harry Reid and said, do it again, get it through, you gotta do it. So we have a tremendous opportunity set on the base of the National Landscape Conservation System that many of you have created. So let's go forward and keep it up. Thank you.
We will take some time for some questions, but I cannot do enough to plead for brevity in the questions. So if you had a longer statement you wanted to make, I'm yearning to hear it, but we'll do that privately between you and me. So if you could just make very, very brief questions, that would be great to get as much of their minds in play here before it. So questions, but again, with just exemplary succinctness, which I'm not sure is myself right now. So you want to just recognize people? Any questions? No, it's right. They're writing haikus. They're writing haikus now. They're trying to be very right here. Any questions? Actually, Mike. Sorry.
Secretary Babbitt, what role?
I was wondering what role risk to particular public land plays in designation of the national monuments initially, not just Grand Staircase and Monte, where there was proposed coal mining, but the ones that followed as well. Was the question of risk a driving factor in selection of areas, or was there an analysis of outstanding resource values, historic and scientific interests that drove the analysis apart from the risk question?
Look, I think the question is really important in a forward-looking way. You know, what are the priorities? How do you develop a matrix as you put the map of the West on the wall? Particularly important in a couple of areas where we've not devoted enough attention. One is Alaska, 50 million acres of land. The other is Nevada, another 20 or 30 million acres, where we haven't quite wrapped our arms around a vision of, say, 50 years out. The risk does kind of put a sharp edge on things. I'll give you just one example. It was certainly a factor in Escalante because of the coal mining on the Perilous Plateau issue. I mean, really mad proposal. And it generated a lot of interest in small towns in southern Utah, awakened the fact that there would be 50 or 60 multi-ton trucks in the main streets of their towns every day for the week throughout the year. But to some, I think this is going to be a really rich debate as you go out around the West. What's the matrix of factors? Biological, geological, historical, cultural, proximity to urban areas? Is that a risk factor or a demand factor? How much can you look at the resource use there and factor some of them? I mean, there are a couple of national monuments where there are, in fact, production levels right now. One is Canyons of the Ancients, the other, I believe, is the Missouri Breaks. There's a little bit of gas production there. And, you know, can you shape an emerging and permanent conservation framework in which you recognize that a resource use should not be expanded, perhaps can be gradually phased out? Great questions. I'd love to come back in 4 or 5 years and hear your answers.
You're going to begin a national conversation about conservation. Have you thought about a North American conservation, about conversation in the Big Bend, Alcarmen area, the Mexican Canada, and on the Canadian-U.S. border, the Flathead River Valley, for example, needs to be more than a Bristol Bay scenario with a ban on mining that needs protection. And being a Canadian and having worked in Mexico, I think the time is right for a continental conversation, which was actually triggered as a bigger road development 8 years ago. It was a continental conservation project.
Yes, actually, both examples that you gave are under active consideration. Ken Salazar visited Big Bend about 2-3 weeks ago, spent 2-3 days down there. We've had the environment minister of Mexico in our offices. We're very interested in exploring a cross-border park. Bruce laid the groundwork for this, as many of you know. Also visiting that area and establishing encouraging the Mexicans to think about this, and it's gestating, and I think there's wonderful possibility there. And then in the Flathead Basin in Montana and up into Canada with Waterton and Glacier National Parks, there's a lot of current activity, as I think you may know. Governor Schweitzer is there's a competition here between Senator Tester, Senator Baucus, and Governor Schweitzer. And man, I guess competition is a good thing, but they're all anxious to move and to push us on this, and we're willing co-conspirators on it to work with Canada to protect that entire basin. So, and I'll say another thing of interest on the international front. In part because of all this time we've been spending on offshore oil and gas, we've become very interested in the Arctic writ large, and internationally, the Arctic Council has been something of a sleepy organization. Ken Salazar called Secretary Clinton and said, I want to go to the next meeting of the Arctic Council. And of course, the bureaucrats of the State Department, had a connection. And then, but of course, Secretary Clinton was fine with it, and the Arctic Council doesn't meet until next year in Greenland, and I suspect you'll see Ken Salazar there. But a couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting of the A5, which are the Arctic, 5 of the Arctic nations up in Ottawa, and guess who was on the plane? Secretary Clinton. It was Ken Salazar. Interested in getting more cooperation scientifically and with climate change impacts, etc., learning more about the Arctic, being smart as an international community on how we move forward in the Arctic. So you're going to see a lot more international activity from this department than you've seen since the Bruce Babbitt era.
Actually, one of the wild people from Gaston Grand Series, they're ready to go.
I just want to say thank you for creating the grand staircase in the town. The town that used to be known, we created a municipal town for the western Atlantic. It was really changed. Now it's a fun, it's a magic place. We're having conversations with the Arctic County Business Procedures Path. They're now talking with us. We're having conversations and good conversations with the city council, the mayor. It's really a wonderful place. Times change. You're not the young energy. We like to buy you back and see this really a magical, fun place. You're right. So it's wonderful. Thank you for what you did.
Just one little footnote. The West, in a historical context, is an endlessly fascinating kaleidoscope of events and progress. And there's one fascinating given to all of these controversies for the last 100 years. And that is the initial opposition inevitably gives way to broad support in which most all the time, the most vociferous voices in opposition emerge as the people telling their grandchildren that they were there arguing for the creation.
Tell them about your grandfather or great-grandfather.
No, let's move on. Let's move on.
Oh, that's a
I have nothing to say. It happened in my family.
I have a question apropos one of David's last comments. There seems to be this emerging, if not settled consensus, that one of the biggest challenges to raising the public profile of the National Landscape Conservation System is the name. To the public, NLCS means baseball, landscapes means lawn, systems might not mean anything. I'm curious to hear that, where the name came from, and whether you think it would be productive to consider changing it.
I didn't quite get the question. Let's try this again. Would it be productive to...
Where the name came from?
First rating of the second.
Which name?
The National Landscape Conservation System.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, let me just say that somebody did a poll about a month ago trying to sort this out and asking about the National Landscape Conservation System. And the poll results came back as follows. National, negative. This implies centralized direction. Landscape, negative. People think of that as their backyard where they're having to chase out rabbits and apply pesticides and hire someone to mow the lawn. That's the perception of landscape. System, an image of an overweening government bureaucracy in every detail of your life. So where did it come from? I don't know.
I'm just curious in thinking about the title, you could include water. It seems to me that the two go inextricably together, and I appreciate that the state constitutions proclaim their ownership of water, but that is a national problem. I know you, the river master of Colorado, you just made a title on that. Could we include water in some aspect of that?
It's a great suggestion. I think it's useful to think of when we say land to have a vocabulary which more often than not says land and water. Good.
The only danger here is that we may spend the next year or two on names. That seems that we are in the midst of the department of trying to figure out a new name for the Minerals Management Service. How's that for a lousy name? But I think we're in an endless kind of downward spiral. And if anyone of you have good names for the Minerals Management Service, I'd welcome that as you're considering new names for the National Landscape Conservation System. I was going to say, let me just say that I think it's worth thinking about a new name, to Bill's point, and I think it's doable. Once you've got congressional imprimatur on the system, changing the name is not nearly as big a lift. If you guys come up with a good one, so send cards and letters to me.
Dave Williams, number one, once Congress has put a label on something, let's just let sleeping dogs lie. Secondly, we have a foundation out there now which has agonized over this endlessly and which has come forth with national conservation lands. Am I right, Brian? And we got to get out there with a moniker rather than kind of sitting around staring at our navels for the next 10 years. So how about national conservation lands? The silence is dead. Now let's get out there. That's the best these guys could come up with. And I point you to them because this is a functioning support group. The leader in Durango, Colorado, is Brian O'Donnell. I want him to stand up so we can all see it. Most of you know it.
So let me change course just a little bit. You guys outlined a great mission and vision for not just the Bureau, but for the NLCS and for the Bureau. But those of us in the Bureau need to think about how we realize and accomplish that. So can you explore a little bit what you see we need to build and investing in terms of capacity and capabilities to accomplish that conservation vision for not to be on as we can get before, but to be on as a manager of these great lands and resources and what for the next generation we need to think about in terms of what, not just in terms of leadership, but infrastructure and capacity capabilities we need to be working for.
That question is for David Hayes.
Well, it's all about, I think, broadening out the expertise and the culture, if you will, of BLM. And there's tremendous opportunity in that respect, not only with BLM, but with the entire department in the next 8 years. Our 70,000 employees, we're going to have 35% of them turning over with retirements, etc., maybe 45%. So I think it's a recruitment opportunity that presents itself. Also, I will say that the reality is that, and this is where the foundation and others can be very helpful, there needs to be an injection of additional support for the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM still suffers, certainly by comparison with the National Park Service, for example, in terms of appreciation for what it's doing on the Hill and elsewhere. And that's why this kind of conference, this kind of endeavor that so many of you are undertaking to shine a spotlight on it is step one. And with the resources and the thoughtful leadership of Bob Abbey and others, recruiting new folks in, there's no question BLM can fill the big shoes that the National Conservation System expects of it.
Well, I'll probably just do 2 more questions, but the recording needs to voice, so if you would say the question very quickly, and then if you could restate this question, because we can't get the mic up there.
Oh, sorry about that. Secretary Babbitt, you're one of the people that actually changed my life. I was a graduate student at
Did y'all hear that okay?
I was a graduate student at the University of Arizona, and I took geochemistry, and I took your staff down the Colorado River when I was working for Grand Canyon Dories, and it changed my life. And now I now do biogeomimicry, mineland reclamation and restoration, and I want to thank you. And that leads me to the question to both of you in this process of understanding the balance and the transition and the demand that, whether it's the old energy economy or the new energy economy, resources demand on our lands. The old concept from the Carter administration of the Natural Resource Trust, it seems like with Secretary Zalazar, with you guys, I mean, you've done so much to bring this back around now, is an overarching concept, and this goes back to some of the questions that were asked earlier, is the concept of the Natural Resources Trust. Are we finally getting to the point where we can have that continental conversation?
Well, I think so.
I'll restate the question. Restate about how it changed your life, too, because that's a key factor.
I think there's a single questioner mentioned that her life was changed by blue sky, but I suspect that others in the audience could make the same statement, including yours truly, by the way. In terms of a national trust, I think that the time is right for thinking along those lines. I mean, that, of course, the Land Water Conservation Fund that's the concept, to have a reliable, robust pot of money to protect special places. What's been missing is the reliability and the robustness.
Yeah.
and we're working on both of those. There are some opportunities going forward. If we do some more oil and gas drilling in the Eastern Gulf, at least 125 miles away from Florida, don't worry, Senator Bill Nelson, there is Congress is going to have to act to do that, because that's one area where a moratorium still exists. There's an opportunity connection with that to potentially hardwire some funding into trust concept of some kind. And we are on the threshold of new revenues, significant new revenues for some renewable projects. And we have a system of, we don't have a royalty-based system for solar and wind, for example. Maybe we should. We probably should for that kind of a resource. That might also be another opportunity for a discussion along those lines, because Congress would need to give us new authority in that regard. So I think it's open field running here in the coming period on these issues, and it fits very, very well with certainly where the President and Secretary Salazar would like to go.
There's a very last question.
I'd just like to make a statement, not a question.
Okay. Could you hand this to Dave Hunter afterwards, where I would like to?
Danny, can you raise your hand?
What I'd like to say, being from Arizona, and I heard earlier that the Department of Interior would have nothing to do with conservation. When you look at what Stuart Udall, another great secretary from our state, what he did really goes back to an experiential commitment of your life, of being in these landscapes and working in these landscapes. And that love and that appreciation of those landscapes is an ingrained part of conservation that you cannot reject. And Secretary Abbott carries on that Arizona tradition, which I'm proud to be part of, and that the Department of Interior has a tremendous record of those managements of those lands. And they are construed by political or other aspects of conservation, which looks at maybe a one-sided position. But conservation is very broad, and it has a lot to do with that love of the land, that appreciation of the land, and us as people, and the people who have come before us. And I'd just like to really thank Bruce for all that he's done, and I'm proud that he's been a tremendous secretary and a tremendous human being.
Thank you, Patty. This pertains probably more to David Hayes than it does Secretary Abbott. I was fortunate enough to work for the Bureau of Land Management for nearly 41 years, and I just recently retired a couple months ago. And in that career, was really fortunate enough to be on the ground at Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area as the manager, where we set up the Bureau's first support group for that kind of unit in the Franklin Red Rock. And secondly, as manager at Grand Staircase for almost 5 years, during some of the tough years, we realized we were not going to win the political battle up front, but that we could concentrate on working on the community in terms of support. And we were very fortunate to have a group step forward of very concerned folks to help us set up the 501c3 group, the Grand Staircase Estimating Department. Okay. That being said, and understanding just how important local support is, regional support is, and those kinds of ground pounders with the folks on the ground, I think it is absolutely critical. And I ask you, what are you going to do in terms of positioning the NLCS for truly some increased funding to the agency, not agency-wide, but NLCS specific?
Yeah. A good question. Obviously, from a long-time insider, thank you for your service. We are going to need to increase the funding for the National Conservation Landscape System, period. And I think that This national conversation that's about to begin and the special focus on our landscapes that will occur in a very high-profile way has the potential to assist us in that regard. Two things have to happen. One is the administration needs to put more money in its proposals to Congress, and number two, Congress needs to match or increase it. We'll work on number one. I want all of you to work on number two.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our speakers.